So engaging with investors on sustainability is at the core of the PRI's mission. That's really what we're trying to do with all of our activities. And so we are in constant contact with our signatories, with our investors, but also with other stakeholders to identify the priority areas where investors will benefit the most from our support. And so when we have identified such priority areas, we will then ask, if we want to see more action on this, why is it not happening already? What barriers are investors facing that's preventing that action? And so, depending on the barrier that we identify, we may work on articulating a bit better the value of investing with a long-term sustainable perspective, or we may provide training or guidance. We may work with the regulator to improve the regulatory conditions, or we may, for example, bring investors together so that they can work jointly on the challenges that they all have in common. For example, with the collaborative initiatives that the PRI supports. And there are two main ways in which stewardship can help create value for investors. The first one would be by enhancing the value of the assets or the portfolio of the investor. And so, for example, they can address a specific challenge, a specific ESG risk at the company that would have impacted the financial value of the company or could have impacted negatively other assets or other stakeholders. And so in that way, they're enhancing the value of their portfolio. Another way, and potentially a more important way, is that stewardship helps address and mitigate risks. And this is particularly important when it comes to system-level risks, for example, those derived from climate change. And climate change is a very good example because the whole financial system and the whole economy are exposed to the risks associated with climate change. And so it will be quite difficult for most investors to diversify away, to divest from their exposure to climate change. Instead, what they can do is influence the root causes of climate change. So, for example, that could be CO2 emissions. And they can identify the best way to do this. For example, they may identify the companies that are the largest emitters, the largest contributors to this risk, and work with them to reduce emissions. Or they can decide that the most efficient way would actually be to work with regulators to create a regulatory environment that supports a transition to a more sustainable system. And so it's this very broad and powerful tool that investors can use. And in terms of encouraging them to do it more, we would say, we would recommend investors to ask themselves, are we using this tool to mitigate risks and create value for our beneficiaries to the maximum extent possible? Or is there something more that we could be doing in this area? Yes, so to develop a stewardship strategy, it's very important that investors consider two main questions. So the first one is, what are we trying to achieve? Why are we going to engage with companies or take other stewardship steps? So when that is defined, the next question is, what is the best way to get there? What would be the best way, the most efficient way to maximize my influence as an investor to drive the change that I am hoping to see? So those two questions are very important to define a stewardship strategy. And on the second one, I would say that an important aspect is to consider the very broad range of tools that investors have at their disposal to advance their stewardship strategy. So that involves engagement with companies, voting, but it also involves working with the regulator or working with other actors in the financial system. And that's where having defined a goal really helps. If you're trying to address systemic risks, for example, you may decide that it's more efficient to work, instead of working with individual companies, to work with the regulator, for example. Because again, if there is a regulatory change that fosters sustainability, that will create change at the market level, as opposed to at the level of a few companies. Or, for example, depending on your position as well in the investment chain, you may identify that actually your main influence is with your asset manager. If you're able to use your position as a client to demand certain practices or to explain the value of certain practices to your asset manager, he or she will then communicate those priorities to the companies or the issuers in which they invest. And so you can create change that gets amplified in the investment chain depending on your position.